All right, welcome back to our APES flipped classroom. Today we're talking about ecosystem services. So when we talk about ecosystem services, what we're talking about are services that the environment or the ecosystem provides to us as humans that have a monetary value. So let's jump right in and talk about what that means. So there are several different categories the ecosystem services can fall into. We could be talking about goods that come from natural resources. So that would be things like lumber or food from hunting, or it could be services or functions that ecosystems carry out that have a measurable financial value for us as humans. So we categorize ecosystem services into 4 broad categories, and there's some overlap between some of these, so don't get too stressed out about how to categorize them, but just in general know that we have 4. So the first one is the easiest one to understand, and this is what we call provisioning ecosystem services. So these are goods that we take directly from ecosystem, things that we can make from natural resources. So when we talk about things we can make from natural resources, we're talking about lumber products. We're talking about food that we hunt, not crops, not domesticated animals, but food that we can either gather from the wild or something that we can hunt in the wild. It can also be wood products. So that would include things like paper and lumber. When we talk about regulating, we're talking about the fact that natural ecosystems are going to help to regulate the climate. They're going to help to regulate air quality. And by doing that, they're actually going to help to reduce storm damage. And in the sense that they filter air for us, they may actually help to reduce our healthcare costs as well. Then we have our supporting ecosystems. So the ecosystem support processes that we do ourselves, making them cheaper and easier. So we could look at the example of bees pollinating crops so that we don't have to pollinate by hand, or we could look at the example of wetlands filtering water so that our groundwater is cleaner and goes through fewer purification steps before it can enter our taps. And then our last type of ecosystem service is cultural ecosystem services. And you'll sometimes hear this referred to as aesthetic ecosystem services. So this is money that is generated by recreation, whether that might be admission fees for parks, camping fees, tours, any of those kinds of things, but it can also be scientific knowledge. But it's important to recognize that when we talk about an ecosystem service, that we are always talking about a measurable financial impact for humans. This is a service provided by the ecosystem to us that has a monetary value. Unfortunately, we tend to disrupt these ecosystem services. And when we disrupt the ability of ecosystems to function in the way in which they are intended, that's going to decrease the value of the services that those ecosystems are able to provide to us. This has ecological impact, which we spend a lot of time focusing on in this class, but it also has an economic consequence. And so a lot of the time when you start hearing about arguments in favor of environmental changes, they're going to focus in on this economic consequence because that's the consequence that we can quantify more easily. So as an example, when we clear land, whether that's for agriculture or to build a city, if we clear cut, that's going to remove trees. Those trees store carbon dioxide. That's going to mean that there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is going to lead to increased climate change, which is going to cause more storm damage and crop failure. We can also look at a different aspect. So when we look at overfishing, that can lead to a population collapse for the fish, and that will in turn cause a loss of fishing jobs and lower fish sales in the future. So in the short term, overfishing provides a lot of goods that can be sold, but in the long term, because it damages the ability of the ecosystem to maintain stasis, that's going to decrease the ultimate value of those ecosystem services. So when we talk about provisioning services, we are talking directly about goods or products that are provided to us by ecosystems. So our examples for fishing, we didn't put the fish there, we're not breeding the fish, we're not feeding the fish, but we're able to harvest fish. Hunting animals that we can then sell, lumber, which gives us wood for furniture and buildings, paper products, again, which come from trees, naturally grown foods, so things like honey, wild grains, berries, anything that we can collect directly from nature. We can also talk about goods and products that are made from those natural resources. So this is really where paper would come in. There are also a lot of medicines that come from natural resources. Rubber, genuine rubber, actually comes from trees. All of these goods and products are going to be disrupted by over-harvesting, by water pollution, by clearing land for agriculture or urbanization. Okay, so regulating services. These are these processes that moderate natural conditions like climate, like air quality. So we could take trees as an example. Trees in a forest are going to sequester carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. They're going to store that carbon in the material of the tree, the leaves, the branches, the roots, and even in the trunk. That's going to reduce the rate of climate change, and it's going to lessen damage caused by rising sea levels, and it's going to reduce crop failure from drought. So it's important to recognize that climate change is kind of this broad overarching term that covers a vast wealth of consequences for our climate, not just temperature, but also rising sea level, increased drought, increased storms. So our trees are going to sequester that CO2. They also filter air by absorbing air pollutants, which reduces healthcare costs. There are a lot of studies that show that the more trees there are, particularly in urban areas, the lower the incidences of childhood asthma and chronic bronchitis, because those trees are excellent filters for air pollutants. And of course, both of these are going to be disrupted by deforestation. So when we talk about supporting services, these are the two that are really difficult to frequently determine which service it falls into, between regulating and supporting. So when we talk about a supporting service, we're talking about a time when an ecosystem supports a process that we as humans do, making that process less costly and easier for us. So we'll go back to the example of the wetlands. Those plant roots are going to filter pollutants, which means that as the water infiltrates through the wetland and into our groundwater, it's being cleaned. And we don't have to pay as much to purify that groundwater with water treatment plants. Another example is that bees and other insects are going to pollinate our agricultural crops, which leads to more crop production and higher profits. By comparison, if we look at vanilla as just one product that you guys are probably fairly familiar with, vanilla is an orchid. It's actually the stamen of an orchid, and so it has to be pollinated by hand. And so that's quite expensive, and it's one of the reasons that true vanilla is relatively expensive. So there are bees pollinating our crops. How do humans impact this? Well, if we cause habitat loss for the pollinators, then we're going to disrupt those supporting services. If we fill in wetlands for development, we're going to disrupt those supporting services. And last, but certainly not least, cultural services. So when we talk about cultural services, we are talking, again, about money. We're talking about revenue from recreational activities. This could be hunting or fishing licenses. This could be fees for entering state parks or national parks. This can be the income for hotel operators, for restaurants, for tour guides, all of that tourism related spending. But it's also profits from scientific discoveries made in ecosystems. One of the big arguments for preserving the rainforest is the number of unique medications that have come from plants and animals in the rainforest. So just a few examples, those pretty landscapes. Everybody likes to go hiking up the mountain so you can see the beautiful vistas. That's going to draw tourists. They're going to pay to enter the parks. They're going to spend their money at local stores and restaurants. They're going to pay camping fees. All of that brings money into an area. Fishermen are going to pay for fishing licenses, but they're only going to pay for those fishing licenses if they can eat the fish that they catch. And so that means that the rivers have to be clean. Scientists are going to learn about plant compounds or even some compounds that come from animals that can lead to the creation of new medicines, which are sold for profit. One of the major success stories for compounds coming from nature is that there's a chemical manufactured by poison dart frogs, which has been used in a number of medications. Again, how do we disrupt this? As humans, we disrupt cultural services by deforestation. Nobody wants to go pay to hike in a park and look at a whole bunch of clear-cut area. Disrupted by pollution, because when we have smog, then it's harder to see those vistas. It can be disrupted by urbanization. So here's our practice FRQ for today. I want you guys to describe one ecosystem service that intact forest ecosystems provide for humans. And I want you to identify a human activity that could degrade that ecosystem service and explain how that activity decreases the value of the ecosystem service. All right, that's it for today. As always, if you have any questions, let me know.